All right. So, in this video, we're going to start looking at chapter 24, which is on the Americas after European exploration. So, if you remember back to when we started talking about what time period 4 would look like, or at least our discussion of time period 4, we were going to do it in 3 parts. The first part was looking at Europe, and we finished doing that one. So now we're going to start looking at the second part, and these are the places that are directly influenced by Europe. And so this is where we're going to start looking at the Americas. And in chapter 25, we're going to look at Africa. And then remember where we're headed. In the third part, we're going to look at the places that were indirectly influenced, which will be China and the Islamic world. So remember, that's kind of our roadmap. So we've done this. Now we're starting in here. All right. So back to the story. We're gonna pick this story back up with Columbus. So remember, Columbus believed he had reached India, which is why Native Americans were called Indians, because Columbus believed that they were Indians. Now, despite Columbus believing that he was an Indian, he believed this pretty much until he died. It turns out that Caribbean islands don't have the riches the Europeans were expecting. So there weren't spices, there wasn't silk, there wasn't gold. So they didn't have the things that the Europeans were looking for when they went exploring. So the Spanish kind of forced the native inhabitants to start gold mining. Now, there is a limited amount of gold on the islands, and the Spanish forced the natives to start mining for gold. And to do this, they used this system called encomienda. The encomienda system. And basically, encomienda was an exchange. This was an exchange of services. So here's the exchange. The natives would work, and the Spanish would take care of them. And when we say take care of them, we mean feed and house and clothe and educate, especially in terms of Christianity. So the natives would work, and the Spanish would take care of the native people. In reality, though, the people who would ensure that the Spanish were actually doing this were in Spain, not in the Caribbean. So encomienda essentially turned into a system of slavery. So encomienda basically became a system of slavery. The native people worked, and the Spanish didn't do anything that they were supposed to do. They simply did the bare minimum in order to get them to work. So really, encomienda was slavery. The problem that arose, however, is that as we talked about when we talked about the Columbian exchange, the native population of the Caribbean was just completely destroyed by disease. So, estimates of what happened are just completely devastating. The estimates show that there were roughly, we'll just give kind of a nice round number, 500,000 people in the Caribbean in 1450. Like, that's what the archaeological and anthropological evidence seems to suggest, that there was all across the Caribbean about 500,000 people. Maybe more, maybe less, but it's a nice round number to play with here. By 1540, so about 50 years after Columbus showed up, there were only a few thousand. And now there are no full-blooded, the people here were called the Taino people. There are no full-blooded Taino people left. There are people who have Taino heritage, but there are no full-blooded Taino people left. And that is all due to disease, mostly. Disease was the biggest culprit. And the brutal conditions the Spanish enforced. Now, to be fair, I'm going to put this over here. There were a few Spanish who resisted this violence towards the native people. Most of them were in the clergy. So they were church people. They were priests, and they worked in the church. And they made a pretty convincing argument. if we want these people to convert to our religion, which is one of the reasons why we sent Columbus over here in the first place, we need to treat them better. Otherwise, they're never going to want to become Christian. So, the guy that we need to know who did this, there was a guy who wrote a letter. His name was Bartolome de las Casas. And so he was a priest who witnessed a lot of this stuff firsthand, and he wrote directly to the King of Spain asking him to intervene on behalf of the native population. And he either didn't get the letter or he read the letter and he ignored it, but nothing really changed. But there were a few Spanish who resisted what they were doing, but there weren't a lot of them, and it really just fell on deaf ears. So at this point, we need to think about what the Spanish are going to be doing next. So as it turns out, the Spanish had very little luck I guess we'll say economic luck in the Caribbean. And most Europeans, and we'll talk about other Europeans in a later video, but most Europeans regarded the Caribbean as a backwater. Like, it wasn't something that they wanted to really invest a lot of money or time in. So most Europeans regarded the Caribbean as a backwater, at least until we get to like the 1700s or the 1800s, when the Caribbean becomes important again as a place to grow cash crops, especially things like sugar or coffee. So for the moment, we're going to leave the Caribbean aside after the Europeans have basically just destroyed it, and come back to it later. The last thing we'll say about the Caribbean is that, seeing as they killed most of the people who originally lived on these islands, they had to import African slaves as workers. And so when we leave the Caribbean now, there's going to be a huge African population and a very small European population. And that's where we're going to leave off, and we'll come back to the Caribbean when we get to time period 5. The other reason that the Caribbean becomes forgotten about is that in the 1500s, the Spanish discover giant mountains, and when I say mountains, I mean actual mountains of silver in North and South America. There's only one problem, though. These mountains are controlled by the Western Hemispheric empires. So, the Spanish are going to have to get rid of them. So the first one to fall first, the Spanish take out the Aztec. And this happens between 1519 and 1521. So the guy that is leading this group of Spanish against the Aztec, his name was Hernan Cortez. And about 400, the term is conquistadors, or I guess conquerors. They tried to just take over Tenochtitlan. So they at first they just tried to take over Tenochtitlan, and they failed. But they did manage to kill the Aztec emperor. So what Cortez had to do was use other means to defeat the Aztec. So Cortez regrouped and found local allies who wanted to remove the Aztec too. Because remember, the Aztec were not well liked. They were just strong enough to force people to pay taxes. So once Cortez got the lay of the land and he found out who was actually around him, there were lots of people that wanted to do what Cortez wanted to do. And so he found allies who wanted to remove the Aztecs just as much as he did. And these allies gave the Spanish supplies, but also knowledge of the environment that the Spanish did not have. So by 1521, the Spanish took Tenochtitlan, captured the new emperor, and tortured him into giving up the location of the Aztec treasures. But he kept his mouth shut, and they just killed him. So what ends up happening, though, is the same thing that happened in the Caribbean. All of the native allies of the Spanish died of disease or were forced into working mining silver. So that's what happened to the people who helped Cortez take out the Aztec. A similar thing happened to the Inca. About a decade later. So this happens between 1532 and 1533. Basically, the same process happens again. This guy, Francisco Pizarro, and this time about 600 conquistadors, conquered the Inca in a similar way. So they found local allies. And they found that their enemies, so they found the Inca were already weakened by disease. And so basically the same thing happens to the Inca as what happened to the Aztec. So at this point, by like the 1540s, the Spanish were technically in control of the entire Western Hemisphere. That's what they claimed. Now, of course, people lived there, and the Spanish couldn't actually control all of it. There were very, very few Spanish in the Western Hemisphere to begin with. But technically, they said that they're in charge of it because they found all of it. It's not the case. There were people who were already living there. But by about the 1540s, they were technically in control of the entire Western Hemisphere, and that meant they started exporting all of that silver back to Europe. And the Spanish get super rich. Like super rich. Crazy rich. Now, the conquistadors were paid in land. So they weren't paid anything initially. They said if you go and you're successful, you're going to get all the land you could ever want. The conquistadors were paid in land. But as the Spanish government saw how lucrative these territories were, the government took over. They couldn't rely on all of these simple soldiers to make sure that Spain got their money. It was far too important for the Spanish government to rely on them. So the Spanish government took over the territories in the 1570s. And they're going to create two giant colonies. One of them is going to be Mexico. Mexico will be called New Spain. And this is all the stuff in North America. The other one is Peru, or New Castile. And it's pretty much everything in South America. These colonies are going to be run by a viceroy. A viceroy is like a vice king. And this person is only answerable to the king. So this guy has all the power in these giant colonies. And he basically ruled independently. And the reason he could rule independently is that he was so far away from his boss he couldn't be stopped quickly. So if he was doing something that the king didn't like, it would take sometimes about a year for the king to even find out about it. And it might take months for orders to come for him to stop it. And even if the king sent orders for him to stop it, the viceroy could say he never got the orders, or the orders were unclear and he didn't understand them. So while he was answerable to the king, he could pretty much do whatever he wanted. And eventually, because they were so far away, this is going to be one of the things that eventually leads to separation and independence. Because the people who are going to live in the colonies are going to start to view themselves as separate and different from the Spanish or the other Europeans that are technically in charge of them, and they're going to start to see themselves as different. But we're going to stop there. In our next video, we'll look at the society that sprung up in these new Spanish colonies and how that's different than what we're going to see in, or what we've already seen in Europe. And because they're different, they're going to eventually, like we said, eventually want their separation and independence from Spain. But we'll worry about that when we get there. And as for now, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.